Okay, now we get to our gospel passage, which comes from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 6, verse 17, and then verses 20 through 26. Jesus came down with the 12 and stood on a stretch of level ground with a great crowd of his disciples and a large number of the people from all Judea and Jerusalem and the coastal region of Tyre and Sidon. And raising his eyes toward his disciples, he said, "Blessed are you who are poor, for the kingdom of God is yours. Blessed are you who are now hungry, for you will be satisfied. Blessed are you who are now weeping, for you will laugh. Blessed are you when people hate you and when they exclude and insult you, and denounce your name as evil on account of the Son of Man. Rejoice and leap for joy on that day. Behold, your reward will be great in heaven. For their ancestors treated the prophets in the same way. But woe to you who are rich, for you have received your consolation. Woe to you who are filled now, for you will be hungry. Woe to you who laugh now, for you will grieve and weep. Woe to you when all speak well of you, for their ancestors treated the false prophets in this way." Ooh, strong words, strong words. Okay, so first things to point out here. So we skipped a bunch. Last week, you remember, we read from chapter 5, verses 1 through 11. So that's the very beginning of chapter 5. Now we're like right in the middle of chapter 6. So we skipped over quite a bit. In fact, it begins by saying Jesus came down with the 12 and stood on a stretch of level ground. Well, if we're just looking based on what we're reading during Sunday Mass, a person who's never heard the gospel before would be like, wait a minute, who the heck are the 12? Who are we talking about here? So the liturgy, the church, in so many ways, expects that we're familiar enough with the scriptures. Because in between the beginning of chapter 5 and the middle of chapter 6, we see a whole bunch of different things. Jesus, he goes healing, and he cleanses a leper, he heals a paralytic, he calls Levi, who's also named Matthew in the other Gospels. There's this question about fasting. Then he's debating with people, so he's getting into it with some people. It's like, we're skipping all of this. It's like, man, I don't know what the deal is. It's probably because it's a long gospel and ordinary time is limited in our duration of it. But anyway, then finally, in verse 12 of chapter 6, so it's really the scene right before this one, Jesus goes up a mountain to pray, and he prays all night, and then he comes down the mountain, and he calls the 12 apostles to be his apostles. He calls 12 disciples, and he names them apostles, that is, those who are sent. And then they go through the list of the 12, which begins with Simon and ends with Judas Iscariot. So then from there, Jesus came down with the 12. So he goes up the mountain, calls his 12 to him, and then with them he comes down now, which is kind of a neat thing to say. Like Jesus he goes up by himself. Now he's coming as the leader of a pack, a leader of a group of people, which is just, again, he's establishing a church. He's establishing a community of people who will continue to follow him after his time on earth is done. They don't know it at the time that he's going to come to an end of his time on earth, and that they're going to be the ones who who lead the show, who lead the church into the next phase, the next season of its life. They don't know that at the time, but this is what's ultimately going on. Is Jesus is the head of his church, but then his church does have leaders within it, beginning with Simon, whose name is Peter. And even Judas Iscariot at the time was a leader of the church, and of course we know that he abandoned ship. But nonetheless, like, Jesus calls saints to this office of apostle, and he clearly calls a sinner to this office of apostle. And even for that matter, Simon, we know, betrays Jesus and denies him, but he repents of that betrayal. Okay, so anyway, so that's a key thing. So now when Jesus comes down the mountain with the 12, and he stood on a stretch of level ground with a great crowd of his disciples. So like, there's clearly more disciples than these 12, but these 12 now have a part, or a role that is set apart from the rest. To lead and to shepherd them. Now, this scene is oftentimes called the Sermon on the Plain. And as I just heard about this, the Sermon on the Plain, that phrase comes from the King James Version of the Bible. They translate this phrase that we have here, that he stood on a stretch of level ground. The King James Version says that he stood on a plain, or he preached from the plain. So that's where that phrase comes from. But most likely, because you picked up on this, surely, and if you didn't now, you've heard it before, that the Beatitudes that Jesus gives here, they sound very similar to the Beatitudes that are given in the Sermon on the Mount. This is the more famous version of this sermon from Matthew's Gospel. And actually, like, the Sermon on the Plain, this stretch of preaching that we're hearing from Jesus, it covers really just like one half of a chapter, whereas the Sermon on the Mount covers 3 full chapters in Matthew's Gospel, Matthew 5, 6, and 7. So anyway, there's differences there, but the same substance is preached in both. And so sometimes people want to say, like, well, this is clearly like two contrasting views of what Jesus is preaching, and so each writer of the gospel is just trying to do his own thing. Actually, a lot of people also believe that no, it's a similar thing, that Jesus probably preached multiple times over the course of his ministry, and so yeah, sometimes like the exact details were not exactly the same, but the substance is the same of what he's preaching. So I think that's a helpful thing. It's like, not like we can say, well, I prefer the Sermon on the Plain to the Sermon on the Mount. Most likely they're substantially the same sermon. So that's, I don't know, a helpful thing for us to consider. Whenever we run into things in the Gospels that seem contradictory, it's like, well, there might not be a contradiction, actually. It just requires us to do a little bit of thinking and a little bit of study to see what other people have said about the thing. Okay, so anyway, so this great crowd of disciples, just like in the Sermon on the Mount, a great crowd of disciples are there. And then it says this, and I was really struck by this. A large number of the people from all Judea and Jerusalem and the coastal region of Tyre and Sidon were there. So it's actually like a pretty big chunk of territory. So I have this thing that I got here, the Then and Now Bible maps. So it's actually kind of a cool thing. It's got a bunch of different Bible maps and stuff in it, as much as I can show you. It's hard to show stuff. Anyway, on this, there's this map that I think is fascinating. So on this map, it shows where Tyre and Sidon are. So Tyre and Sidon are up here. These two spots are, it's like a mirror image. Okay, so anyway, they're in the north, on the coastal region, as it says. And then Judea and Jerusalem, like Jerusalem is down here. So that's a pretty big chunk of territory to cover. In fact, I did like a rough estimate, because there's like this little key of distance here. It's something like 140 miles of distance that is covered by all of those who come to hear Jesus. Like, people are like, we don't, it's hard for us to wrap our minds around this because we have vehicles and airplanes. So like when I travel 140 miles, well, I jump in my car and I get there in a couple of hours, maybe 2.5 hours if I take my time. For these people, like, to travel 50 miles, they did that on foot, or maybe like they had like horse and, like a trailer of some sort. But it took them an incredibly long amount of time to get somewhere relative to how we travel today. And so just to think about that, like they hear about this preacher. And this preacher he has authority. He's healing people. He's casting out demons. He's like changing. He's like bringing life-changing encounters for people. And they're talking about how he might be the Messiah. And so like people are dropping everything to travel for hours, maybe days, to hear him preach. That's remarkable. Like nowadays we have things like YouTube that, like if I want to hear someone preach, I'll look up their name on YouTube, and maybe if they're really good, then maybe I'll watch more YouTube videos. But I'm certainly not going to like travel to Texas, or I'm not going to travel to like for me to travel to the Twin Cities is like a 5-hour drive. I'm not going to do that just to go listen to someone preach. It's not likely. Maybe, but not terribly likely that I'm going to just drop everything and do that. But for them, like they weren't distracted like we're distracted today. They didn't have all kinds of creature comforts or low and earthly comforts that we tend to have today. And again, it's not that I'm not saying the internet is bad. I'm just saying like it's different, and it's different in a way that they were just willing to drop everything and travel for long periods of time, long distances, just to hear someone preach, and in this case, to hear Jesus preach. It makes me wonder about like, so I'm a priest, so it's. But I think if I wasn't a priest and the only possible mass for me to get to was 400 miles away, would I be willing to travel that distance just to get to mass because I knew that mass was so important? Would I be willing to do that? I don't know. It's, like I said, I'm a priest, so I don't have to think about these kinds of things. But I think it could be possible that I know it's possible for some people in our country, but I think it's going to become increasingly possible that people, to get to Sunday Mass, are going to have to travel a distance, and maybe not 5 hours, but maybe a half an hour, maybe an hour, just to get to Mass. Are people going to be willing to do that? I think the disciples of Jesus are going to be willing to do that. And then maybe others who are interested, and if in their interest they discover that they believe it, then maybe they'll be willing to do it for longer periods of time to become a committed disciple. Anyway, it's like a big tangent that I wasn't really planning on talking about, but it's interesting. Okay, anyway, so then what? He raised his eyes to his disciples, and then he starts preaching. And this is the sermon. And we're actually, so that's a fascinating thing. We're going to hear this sermon this week, next week, and the week after, and then we're going to actually be interrupted. We're not going to make it through, I don't think, because Lent is going to come. And I think about this is interesting because year A, so we're in year C right now, and we're interrupted by this sermon of Jesus. In year A, we have a very similar thing, that ordinary time before Lent is just a brief period of time, and we're always interrupted in the Sermon on the Mount by Lent. So it's like both year A and year C, so this is year C, year A is going to be, next year, we're going to be interrupted by this similar or same sermon of Jesus. It's like, oh man, if only we could make it through it. If only there was a way for us to read Scripture outside of the context of Mass. Oh wait, there is. We have Bibles. We can read it. We don't have to panic about it. Anyway, it's just kind of an interesting thing. Okay, so then from there, Jesus gives these 4 Beatitudes and 4 woes. So we're familiar with the Beatitudes. Again, the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus gives 8 Beatitudes. The Sermon on the Plain, as we'll call it that, I guess. The Sermon on the Plain, or this level ground, it has 4 Beatitudes and 4 woes. The Sermon on the Mount has no woes that come with it, except that one, in its longevity and its length, it actually has a lot more warnings from Jesus about how we need to be really careful. So in a way, I suppose there are woes. He just doesn't come out formally and say, "Cursed are you if you do this." Although he does kind of get at that in those things. Okay, so anyway, so that's the context. So we know, like, okay, there's the 8 Beatitudes. Now there are 8 in the Sermon on the Plain, but 4 of those are Beatitudes, 4 of those are woes. And they're really fascinating to think about. So, blessed are you who are poor. Blessed are you who are hungry. Blessed are you who are weeping. Blessed are you when people hate you, and when they exclude and insult you, and denounce your name as evil on account of the Son of Man. So those are similar to some of the Beatitudes in the Sermon on the Mount, but not exactly the same. Matthew's version says, blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are those who mourn. Whereas Jesus says, blessed are you when you're hungry. So in the Sermon on the Mount, it's blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. Jesus is just like, no, when you're poor, when you're hungry, when you're weeping now, those who are weeping now. And then both of them include this blessing of those who are persecuted for the sake of Jesus, because of Jesus. Anyway, it's an interesting thing. And in fact, the Catechism of the Catholic Church, this big book that we have, it says that the Beatitudes give the profile of Jesus. So you think about Jesus, how he was poor. We talked about how Joseph and Mary, when they went to present him in the temple, they gave the secondary option, which was the option for those who couldn't afford the first option, the 2 turtle doves or the pigeons. They were poor in that way. Blessed are those who are hungry now. Well, Jesus, he talks about how he had nowhere to lay his head, and so presumably he wasn't keeping like a store of food, or at least if he had some food, it wasn't like an excessive store of food. There were possibly times when they simply ran out. We don't know exactly what that looked like, but it's certainly a possible thing that they just ran out of food, and so they had to kind of experience hunger in a certain kind of way. We also know that people provided for them. So like I said, we don't know for sure what that looked like. Blessed are those who are now weeping. We know that there are a couple of times in the Gospels, like one time Jesus looks over at Jerusalem and he just weeps over the city of Jerusalem because he knows that the city is going to reject him. He weeps at the death of Lazarus. So blessed are those who are now weeping. And then, of course, we know that Jesus is hated, that he's rejected, he's cursed, cursed in the human sort of way, crucified by way of what he's preaching and teaching. People reject him. So it gives it like a profile. But then the Catechism also says it gives something of a vocation for those who are disciples. That is to say, a disciple is someone who imitates Jesus. So if we're seeking to imitate our master, then yes, we want to imitate his good qualities, his preaching, his teaching, his charisms, the movements of the Spirit. But we also, in a real way, imitate those unpleasant things that he experienced through our poverty, through our hunger, through our weeping, and our being persecuted for his sake. So it's like a call for us. And so we can kind of wonder, like, what might that look like? We have these practices of fasting, this practice of almsgiving. We have this reality of people in our lives who don't believe in Jesus. Do we weep over them? Do we feel bad that, like, gosh, I wish there was a way for them to come to believe in Jesus? And are we bold enough or external enough in our practice, our belief in Jesus, that it actually causes people, like the Psalm said, to scoff at us? And it's not that we're going around looking for scoffers, but simply by living out our Catholic faith, one of the consequences will be that people will just simply not understand. What are you doing? Like they won't get it. So anyway, so that's like an interesting thing. But then from there he gets into these curses when he says, "Woe to you! So cursed are you who are rich. Cursed are you who are filled now. Cursed are you who laugh now. Cursed are you who when all speak well of you." These are kind of interesting things because again, so Old Testament. So in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 28, the Lord gives through Moses gives a bunch of ways that people can receive blessings from him. And the primary way that people receive blessings from him are those who are obedient to God's laws, those who follow his laws. But among the blessings that he's going to give are things like prosperity, things like long life, things like wealth and good weather and a good crop. Whereas those who are disobedient are going to receive poor crop. They're going to receive a division and short life and like a poverty in a kind of way. So it's strange that Jesus in the Beatitudes is lifting up those things that the book of Deuteronomy would say actually come in a way as a result of disobedience to God's will. And of course we know that Jesus isn't encouraging us to be disobedient to God's will, but there's something strange about like the things that before were seen as a curse are kind of seen as a blessing now. And why is that? And the things that before were seen as a blessing are seen, if not as a curse, certainly as a great danger. Like this is the new covenant of Jesus. It like comes and flips everything upside down. And it's not to say that now suddenly we should seek to be disobedient to God's will. No, it's that now as a result of God's will, because Jesus suffers and dies on a cross, this humiliating death, for us as a result of being faithful to God's will, in so many ways it seems like it's a prediction that those who are faithful to God's will encounter suffering, will encounter those things that seem like they were a fruit of cursing, but actually they're a blessing. They're a sign that God is with us, that he abides in hearts that are just and true. Whereas those who are filled up with pleasures and earthly joys and earthly attachments, well, they're dangerous because they can turn our hearts away from God. Like Jeremiah was talking about, the ones whose hearts go astray because they trust in flesh. They trust in themselves rather than trusting in God, in his ways. You think of what worldly blessings bring to people. Of course, many great pleasures, but with pleasure, there's distractions, there's attachments, there's vanity, there's pride, there's gluttony. There's all kinds of different possible ways that these earthly things can turn us away from God. And so Jesus is like, you got to be careful about this. You got to be really careful. This is part of why the church has the practice of almsgiving. It's just to like call people to attention of like, hey, you might have more than you need. And that, if you're not careful, it can become a curse for you. And so why not give some away to people who don't have enough? You might have enough in your pantry, but if you're always being filled up and you're not ever hungry, that could be a dangerous thing. And so why don't you fast from time to time so that you can just always be aware of your need for God. Not your reliance on yourself, but your need for God. Those who have these other, the poverty, the hunger, the sadness, those who are hated, it just points to a clear need for God, for his protection, for his grace. And then on top of that, it shows us that blessings come by way of suffering, just like Jesus. His resurrected life comes by way of his cross, of his death on the cross. So Jesus in so many ways is preaching the cross to us in this first part of the sermon that we have here. Okay, anyway, so good. It's a little challenging, I know, but it's good anyway. It's good nonetheless. We can delight in the laws of the Lord. So there we go. We got a longer one here, but we got our second reading still coming up. So God bless you.